So last week I went to my local Barnes & Noble and I picked up a copy of the brand spanking new Halo Edge of Dawn novel. And because I, just like everyone else, was dying to know what happens immediately after the events of Halo Infinite, I read the whole thing in one day. And then I read it a second time, and then I started writing this video. And for anyone wondering, yes, the novel does actually set the stage for Halo 7, but it does this in a really rewarding way that I don't think will disappoint those who have been feeling like too much of the main plot points have been happening outside of the games. That's not to say there isn't plenty of new lore and events that occur, which have already led the community to start crafting some pretty crazy theories about the Endless and the future of Halo, and some of our most beloved characters. But I don't want to give away everything here, so you're just gonna have to sit back and enjoy the video if you want to learn more. And since this is of course going to be a pretty in-depth summary, I want to remind everyone that there are spoilers ahead. But let's not waste any more time and dive right in. The story opens on the pilot, Fernando Esparza, recording an audio log for his wife, which is more or less a summary of Halo Infinite. And it's here that we learn that the holographic disc of the woman and child he had been seen carrying throughout the game is not actually of his family, and was instead something that he had acquired at some point after the fall of the UNSC Infinity. I don't think we'll ever really know if this was always going to be the case, and I'm not really sure how that would come up in conversation during the game, but I don't know if this was at all necessary. With that said, I can definitely see what Kelly Gay was doing in trying to establish that he was a survivor who, for 6 months, was trying to cling on to anything that he could to help keep him sane, meaning that in attaching himself to this surrogate family, he still had something to ground him and remind him of his real one. So while some might find this kind of weird, in a way, it's a coping mechanism for someone who has really been suffering alone for a really long time. But that change aside, he then goes into how he was one of the many engineers sent to work on humanity's flagship, having to leave behind his family in order to pursue this opportunity. Sadly, he believes that his homeworld was attacked by Cortana during her attempt to pacify humanity and knows that they are most likely gone. But of course, hopes that he's wrong. We then jump forward to the moment where Chief and Joy had re-established communications with the pilot, finally reappearing after having been missing for 3 days. But to them, after jumping into the mysterious portal as the silent auditorium collapsed around them, it had only felt like seconds. Esparza then homes in on their location, and the Chief hops aboard the Pelican. But once they've cleared the area, he gets the two up to speed on everything that had happened during their absence, detailing how the death of Eshram had sent the Banished into a frenzy, leading to daily broadcasts of prisoner executions, the retaking of multiple fobs that Chief had liberated, and the other races in the Banished turning on the humans within their own ranks. Alongside this, the Banished had entered a period of mourning, with today being the last of a 4-day-long funeral to honor their war chief. The weapon also notes that Rubicon Protocol is still active, the UNSC directive which authorizes any means necessary to disrupt or halt the progression of Banished operations on Zeta Halo. And with most of their high-ranking leadership on the ring having been killed by John in the previous days, their next priority should be preventing a new leader from rising out of the ashes. Or as John puts it, it means that they're going to have to fan the flames, sow chaos and division. And oh boy, is that what they do. But amidst their planning, Esparza asked the AI to share this perfect name that she had come up with for herself, which she had alluded to in the final seconds of Halo Infinite's campaign. At first she kind of fakes us out and jokes that her name would be Steve, a name that Master Chief himself said that he liked, but of course she was merely joking. The name she truly wanted to call herself was Joyeuse. Now, I've talked a little bit about the literary origins and the significance of that name in the Halo and Marathon franchises in a previous video, so I won't bore you all here with that, but both agreed it was a name well suited for her good-natured and joyful attitude. For a moment though, John had feared the possibility that she would call herself Cortana, and was certainly relieved when she had chosen to separate herself from her predecessor. As they cruised into the atmosphere of Zeta Halo, they entered the debris field just above the ring, a graveyard filled with bodies, vehicles, scrap, and the reminders of their loss to the Banished. But for the moment, they were heading to a temporary base of operations that Fernando had established, hidden aboard the remains of UNSC frigate FFG 611, now rebranded as Casa de Esparza. Here he had set up a livable area where they could breathe and move around outside of Banished territory, and it was here that Chief could finally take off his helmet and the two would go on to share a warm meal. There's actually a really interesting moment here where Chief watches as Esparza administers some kind of painkiller to help him relax, which, when he realizes that Chief saw, acts ashamed of. John doesn't shame him though, and instead is very empathetic and understanding given the situation. John then thinks that this was the right time and goes on to hand him back his holographic disc that he had found in the House of Reckoning, which seemed to really brighten up Esparza's mood, even if it wasn't actually his own family. But after months in stasis and several days of sustained fighting, he was happy to have some real nutrients enter his exhausted body, and then settled in for a few hours of sleep. While Chief and Aspar's arrested, Joy connected to the ship's database and tried to learn more about humanity, because while she was a hyper-intelligent artificial intelligence made from the cloned brain of the Dr. Catherine Halsey, she was essentially a blank slate, having only been created for the sole purpose of locking down and helping destroy Cortana. So giving her a crash course on everything else was not required. Much to her disappointment, the ship's AI had scrubbed the records and only left the crew's personal logs, so she would have to string together what she could with the information pulled from John's Mjolnir database and that which she had gathered from various fobs that he had liberated, all in order to get a better picture of their species. This all but took her a matter of moments, so when she was done, she went on to watch the Chief sleep, almost like we had seen Cortana do in their time adrift on the UNSC Forward Unto Dawn. Joy then goes on to ponder the possibility that she herself may one day make the same mistakes as Cortana, and thinking out loud, she questions whether her survival was a constant reminder of Cortana, or was instead a chance at redemption. The Chief then comes to while she was asking this, and he actually answers honestly, replying sometimes and yes. And because talking about his emotions is not really something he's ever been good at, and because he's still emotionally raw after Cortana's betrayal, he refuses to lower his guard and really allow himself to connect with Joy. The conversation ends here for now because they've got a lot of work to do. They then spent the day salvaging what they could from the ship, gathering an assortment of rifles, grenades, ammunition, and to their luck, an Eris nuclear device. They loaded some of their haul onto the Pelican, and some they stored here in the frigate. After departing their makeshift home and setting their sights on the House of Reckoning, Joy reminds the team that she is still in possession of Despondent Pyre's Encephalon core, having retrieved it from the Harbinger after their final encounter. And for those unaware, the Encephalon acts as a passkey that allows her nearly unrestricted access to Zeta Halo systems, which, even though without a monitor, still had dozens of sub-monitors managing it and working to repair the fragmented ring with a wide array of sentinels. Her plan, she reveals, is to take control of some of these workers without gaining their attention. Chief then hops out of the dropship and traverses the debris field on foot, escorting Joy to one of the main groupings of sentinels, among which she identifies 2 who have broken off from the rest of the flock, prime candidates for her plan. She then hops from Chief's Mjolnir and takes control of 2 new friends, calling them cute, and even asks Chief if she can keep them. Sadly, he lets her know that he doesn't do pets. As they approached this massive command structure, they observed perhaps the largest gatherings of Banished ever seen on Zeta Halo, because looming in the sky were 3 colossal dreadnoughts, flanked by numerous smaller aircraft such as Banshees and Phantoms, and filling the valley was a massive crowd made up of thousands of Sanghili, Jiralhane, Letgolo, Kigyar, Ungoi, and even some humans, all of which having gathered to pay their respects to the Banished war chief and witness the crowning of his successor. And I do this a couple times throughout the summary, I apologize, but there's actually a really great line here that I wanted to share, because it's a great reminder to us fans as to how the Banished is actually operating, even though there's still a lot of prejudice and general disdain between some of the species. And it goes a little something like this. Joy looks out to the crowd and notes that she understands the basic philosophy of the Banished, but still finds it extraordinary that Atriox was able to unite all of these different species under one banner, despite the eons of established hierarchy and Covenant-era norms. But in response, Chief clarifies that they're not united out of a common goal, but rather because they're free to pirate, kill, and wage war, all while under the protection of the Banished. I know a lot of people can sometimes question what the goal of the Banished really is, but I think that this line is really a reminder that it's really just a group of mercenaries, clans, and bloodthirsty pirates who are hell-bent on getting the upper hand in the galaxy. But using her new Sentinel friends, Joy establishes a live feed of the funeral, revealing that standing atop the House of Reckoning was none other than the somehow still living Jega Rdomnai, and 4 potential replacements for Eshram. And utilizing the Banished database, she was able to identify them. First was Ballas, chieftain of the Ravaged Tusks, Galleon, chieftain of the Witch's Eye, Val Hasumai, an intelligent Sanghili warlord with an impressive service record, and last but not least was Danacrium, the weakest of the commanders, but one who had come from the same clan as Eshram. The story's perspective then shifts over to Jega, as we find out that his survival is the result of his advanced cybernetics, with his internal nanotechnology still working to dissolve the projectiles lodged in his chest, which had narrowly missed one of his 2 hearts. But the pain from these injuries was nothing compared to the guilt that he felt, having failed to stop the Spartan from reaching Escharum. He theorized that perhaps, if the brute were in full health, and not suffering an illness like we saw him battling throughout the campaign, he might not have been bested. We then learned some new lore about ancient Jiralhane funeral traditions, which is a real treat because, as we know from their time with the Covenant, most of the various species had given up their traditions and beliefs due to the standardized Covenant religion. But unlike Jega's abandonment of Sanghili customs, Eshram had not turned his back on the Jiralhanes. Jirohane funeral tradition, much like the other aspects of Jirohane belief, is rooted in the worship of the moons, Wariel, Tish, and Soy-Rapt, which once orbited the now destroyed Doizak. The affair was known to be a glorious and brutal one, with the dead unceremoniously severed into three: hand, head, and body, done by a render whose sole job it was to butcher the dead. In the days of old, there were so many renders that it was enough to form their own roaming clans to service the constant flow of corpses, due of course to the Jirohane's war-driven society. And upon the hand of the dead, they would carve the symbol for Soy-Rapt, the head Wariel, and the body with Tish. The funeral would then last for 4 days, and each of the last 3 nights, these symbols would be carved into the flesh of each part, acting as blood tithes to the moons. Then, on the final night, the body would be left to the elements, allowing the beasts of Doizak to feast upon the remains and do with it as nature intended. During their time with the Covenant, those who secretly carried on this tradition had revised it slightly to accommodate their situations, simply carving symbols on the body, head, and hands, then leaving the body where it laid, tossing it out of an airlock, or disposing of it in an incinerator. Any option made do, but the latter would be the case for Escharam's body, and upon the blowing of a horn by Denacrium, the pyre was lit, and the massive Jirohane's body was turned to ash. These 4 commanders wasted no time in staking their claim for leadership, with Ballas taking the stage first to voice his disdain for Cortana and her human creators. Galleon then joined in, promising that he would not stop until every human on the ring was ripped limb from limb. This definitely sent an unease throughout the human clans in attendance and ignited a look of bloodlust in the Kig-Yar, who were ready to attack if only given the word. Asumai then tried to calm the crowd down by reinforcing that petty squabbles amongst them would only be a temporary solution, and their true goal should be the total destruction of Earth. Galleon then spoke up once more, calling out Jega for his failure to stop the Master Chief. But this was a grave mistake, and Jega did not tolerate his arrogance. He then disappeared for a split second, and then reappeared with his cybernetic arm-mounted blade ignited, thrusting it into the brute's abdomen, and in a quick motion, he sliced Galleon in 2. The crowd was silent for a moment, but then erupted with violence, with the Kig-Yar jumping to prey on the humans, and the Jirohane smashing the Ungoi with their hammers. Jega then called out for these hostilities to end, and then kicked Galleon's body off the structure. He informed this army that he did not care who led, but simply wanted vengeance, and to finish the mission Escharam began. In response, Ballas revealed that he had discovered Jega was still in possession of a human prisoner, Lucas Browning, the medic who was first introduced in Halo Infinite's audio logs, and was the one used to free the Harbinger from her Silex. Asumai speculated that perhaps the Harbinger had left secrets in her human pet, and that is why the Blademaster had not yet killed him. Things were now only moments from spiraling out of control, so in a blur, Jega grabbed Browning and retreated to his personal phantom, quickly fleeing the scene. Chief, having witnessed all of this transpire, abandoned his position and sprinted back for the Pelican. But, not wanting to waste this perfectly good opportunity to take out a good chunk of their enemy, asked Joy to wait until his ship was clear of the area before activating their nuke. Then, moments later, Joy had her Sentinel drop the 10-kiloton payload, obliterating the structure and these banished forces. As the team evaded detection, they followed Jega's Phantom and arrived at a large lake with a rock formation in its center, this being home to the Sangheli's secret base of operations, Rdomnai Keep. They then stealthily infiltrated the structure, finding it to be an interconnected system of caves and tunnels that went far beneath the ring's surface. They then eventually arrived in a holding area that acted as Jega's personal prison, being home to a series of holding cells and a smaller version of the same torture device we saw being used on prisoners throughout the campaign. But rather than the pilot or Spartan Griffin, Chief would find Lucas Browning. As he freed Browning, his appearance was not good. Bloodied, dirty, severely malnourished, and almost skeletal, missing chunks of flesh and suffering sores around his wrists that had begun to rot from prolonged skin breakdown. But with no time to waste, Chief threw him over his shoulder and attempted their escape. As they neared their exit, Browning was able to acknowledge that in fact a Spartan was actually standing before him, but locked in a hallucination from his weakened state, had mistaken Chief as Benita Stone, the first of several Spartan 4 casualties that John had encountered here on Zeta Halo. All the while, Jega eagerly watched their actions, having purposefully left Browning for Chief to find. He did this to allow his enemies the chance to uncover the secrets embedded in the medic's mind by the Harbinger, and to help locate the Harbinger herself, who he was not yet aware had already been killed several days prior. But what he truly desired was the Encephalon core, which he knew she had obtained from Despondent Pyre. Here he also makes it clear that he did not care for the Xalanen or the prospect of the Endless, seeing their alliance as an unnecessary risk, fueled only by Atriox and by extension, Escharam's ambition to use them to achieve greater power. And as he monologued to himself how he would end this demon, a jackal rushed into the room to inform him of the situation. But lost in his hatred, Jega quickly turned to the sudden disturbance with the ignition of his blade, cutting his subordinate in two. The scent of seared flesh that followed then triggered the Sangheili to enter a trance, causing him to remember back to the very moment that changed his life forever. Jega returns to the day that he and his fellow brothers of the Silent Shadow were deployed to the Covenant moonbase Rangiran, where a trap had been set to capture 2 Spartan headhunters. This being a callback to the Halo Evolution's headhunter story, meaning that their 2 targets were Spartan 3's Roland B210 and Jonah B283. Jega and his brothers then laid in wait as the 2 worked their way through the camp, watching as they killed the various troops stationed there. But upon the death of the last standing Sangheili, the Spartans lowered their guard, and Jega saw his opening. Completely unaware of his presence, Jega pressed the hilt of his energy sword against Roland's back and ignited his blade. Easily slicing through the armor, he lifted the human up off the ground, causing Roland's body to go stiff. In response, Jonah fired several rounds into Jega's shields before the elite thrust the blade upwards, slicing through his shoulder and then disappearing once again. Now surrounded, the Sangheili were prepared to capture and prepare him for interrogation. So, in a last-ditch effort, he threw a disruptor device to stun his enemies, but the numbers were against him, and he was quickly restrained. The elite who now held him by the throat boasted their supposed victory, but unbeknownst to them, the Spartan had set multiple explosive charges throughout the area, and with the pressing of his detonator, the camp was set ablaze with fire and plasma. Jega was unable to move in time, as he was one of the elites who had been affected by the disruptor. He was then engulfed by the explosion, with his left arm and mandibles being vaporized. Returning to reality, Jega regained his composure and turned his attention to the charred and corroded knife sitting on one of his shelves. That knife being the very one wielded by Jonah, which he keeps as a reminder for his hatred of the demons. But he also reflects on how he was the only survivor of this attack, and knew that the Covenant would not be coming to his rescue. Yet, much to his surprise, someone did come. The Banished. Escharum and his crew in particular. And despite the heating of the other Sangheili to have him take his own life rather than live disfigured, he would not submit to death, asking instead to be rebuilt so that he could carry out his vengeance against all Spartans. And despite the disapproval of others, Escharum would be the only one to support Jega's ambition, leading the 2 to become very close allies, forging a very unlikely yet strong friendship. And I have to say, I really love this little bit of character development, as it finally helps us understand why Jega was so loyal and attentive to Escharum, because not only was he his friend, but also the one who pulled him from the fire and helped build him back up. So it's no wonder why he's been so hyper-focused on doing everything he can to avenge his death. Cutting back to the team, Chief and Browning had emerged for extraction, only to be set upon by more Banished forces. Flanked by ghosts, brute prowlers, and banshees, they were pinned down as Fernando flew overhead, also under heavy fire. That is, until one of Joy's sentinels came to their aid, slicing a banshee in 2 with its beam. Joy's sentinels then provided cover until they were ultimately destroyed, but their diversion allowed Chief and Browning enough time to board the Pelican and escape. However, their ship had taken heavy damage during their retreat, but they were able to set it down for the night and got some rest. Working all through the night, they managed to evade Banished patrols, but with time running out, Chief knew that they had to even the playing field. So, using the last of their rocket launcher ammo, he picked off a Banshee and a patrol group, drawing the attention of 4 others. He then switched to an S7 sniper, picking off 3 more. And with the last quickly approaching, he steadied his assault rifle and prepared a plasma grenade, but was stopped when he heard a human voice enter his comms channel. And to everyone's surprise, Spartan 4 Thomas Horvath emerged from overhead. Jumping into a freefall, Horvath grabbed onto the Banshee's hull, ripped open its cockpit, and with a quick yank threw its jackal pilot out to its death. Horvath then linked up with the team, and is at first startled by the presence of Joy, mistaking her for Cortana, but after calming him down, they got Horvath up to speed on everything that had happened in the last few months. The deaths of Cortana, Escharum, the other high-value targets, and their recapturing of multiple FOBs. This information reignites a spark within Horvath, and he then informs them on how a team of UNSC survivors were able to get a distress signal out with the current coordinates of Zeta Halo. And this was actually something that we saw happen during the events of the novel Halo Rubicon Protocol, and in terms of later in this story, that distress signal is received by a fan-favorite character, which gives huge implications for what we may see happening in Halo 7. But Browning then draws attention to the fact that the Harbinger did something to his mind, attaching something to a memory that was a series of numbers which represented his service number. He then says the Harbinger called it an insurance policy, referring to it as a Gayash. And to his surprise, Joy knows exactly what he's referring to, as Gayash are a genetic imprint, leaving behind instructions or subconscious orders that might pertain to a single individual or be passed down throughout the generations, much like how the Librarian had done with ancient humans on Earth so that Forerunner systems would recognize them as the Reclaimers. Joy then mentions that if they could find a Lifeworker station, she might be able to remove the gay ash from Browning and even decode it to figure out what she was planning. But before departing, Horvath tells him about a settlement of survivors nearby, and Joy does some quick repairs to fix his Mjolnir and gives his AI a boost. Chief then arms him with an assault rifle, sidearm, box of ammunition, overshield module, and even his grapple hook, to which Horvath thanks him by saying, "Thanks, Dad, now all I need is my raincoat and lunchbox." I gotta say the Chief definitely smirked under his helmet at that one, but with that, Horvath went airborne and drew the attention of other patrols, while the team set coordinates for the Lifeworker station. They journeyed farther up the ring's curvature, leaving behind the fragmented and damaged timberland landscape for a warmer and more jungle-like climate, witnessing herds of deer-like and long-necked elk creatures, surely complemented by a wide array of other small mammals, reptiles, and insects who were hidden to the naked eye. Eventually, they would come across the ruins of an ancient human settlement which Joy noted had belonged to a long-extinct branch of their ancestors, known as the Tudejsa, originally placed here by the Lifeworkers, but had probably died out due to the Flood's presence on the ring nearly 100,000 years ago. And the Flood is actually a really interesting thing to talk about in the context of the average human in the modern era, because when Joy mentioned them, it sent a chill down Fernando's spine. So he definitely knows what they are, but the average person would not. Because to his knowledge, the Unified Earth Government, and UNSC for that matter, never issued a formal statement about the parasite. Yet he and many others within the service had heard stories of those who had encountered them in the final days of the war. Not long after, they came to a stop when Chief began to hear voices just up ahead, more particularly the voices of humans. So after making his presence known, Chief is able to talk them into lowering their weapons, and they introduce themselves as two ODSTs, named Hightower and Gainey, who were currently on watch duty. At first, they seemed very cautious to accept that Chief was friendly, and after Joy introduced herself, they kind of responded in the same way that Horvath did. But they quickly came around and said that when the next shift change happened, they would escort them to the settlement. When they enter this region shrouded by Forerunner cloaking technology known as Dazzlers, they emerge into an area that we know as the Halo Infinite map Forbidden. And among these ruins, a relatively large group of UNSC survivors have set up shop and called the location home. And since the Banished haven't been able to find them, they have finally had a chance to tend to their wounded and repair their technology. Chief then took the opportunity to ask if they had any intel on the UNSC Infinity, to which the ODSTs couldn't say much more than it had gone down somewhere beyond the ring's fracture. They then ventured further into camp, now surrounded with patinaed granite and jungle overgrowth. Along the way, they would encounter many of the survivors, with it being clear that the Master Chief's presence immediately raised morale, even amongst the most wounded. And being surrounded by plenty of competent personnel, Chief breaks off from the rest of the group to report in, and Browning gets some proper medical attention from the same doctor who had worked on Chief and the rest of Blue Team after Operation Wolf. It wasn't long before the leader of the survivors, Commander Wes Thompson, introduced himself. And I just gotta say that when I saw his name pop up in the book, I was beyond excited, because I actually don't get to see my name used in media very often. So to whoever decided, whether it be Kelly Gay or otherwise, thank you so much for including such a cool name in your story. But anyway, the commander was beyond pleased to have someone of his expertise in his presence, and excitedly asked for a sit-rep on the state of Zeta Halo. After being offered whatever resources he would need, Chief would be directed to Lifeworker Central's main control room, a structure denoted by two huge monoliths, which were giving Joy the sensation of being watched, a point that I want everyone to remember, as it's important for a theory I have here in a few moments. But making his way up the stairs of the structure, he would enter the facility, and upon passing its rectangular door, triggered the appearance of a hard-like construct resembling a UNSC scientist who identified herself as Dr. Eugenia Dawson, with several other scientists revealing themselves as well. To summarize what's going on here, at some point during the UNSC's research on Zeta Halo, Dawson and 4 other scientists had accidentally activated an advanced Forerunner device that essentially archived them, sort of like how the Didact used the Composer to make his Prometheans, but not really. We can guess that this technology is essentially converting their essences into perhaps machine data, although it's not really made clear exactly what happened, but she does claim that they retain all of their memories, still possess the ability to think, and still retain their individual identity, unlike an AI would. The only thing that they were lacking, of course, was a living body. But to that, these hard light projections that they could manifest as were so close to the real thing that not even Chief or the ODSTs could tell they weren't human. After that complicated explanation, they jump at any chance to help however possible because they've sort of been stuck in this structure with no chance to leave. Although their understanding of Gayish technology wasn't going to be of much help. However, they did think that they could learn more from a nearby Lifeworker archive. So they gave them the coordinates and they were on their way. This archive was some distance away, with the structure being partially submerged in a swamp filled with bioluminescent plant life. And after landing, Esparza would stay behind to guard their ship, with Chief arming him with C-10 explosives to seal the entrance should the Banished arrive. Meanwhile, the others would venture into the structure, eventually making their way into a massive room where they discovered a Forerunner plinth, prompting Joy to access it in search of clues to access Browning's Gaesh. But as Joy searched the archive, Chief wanted to take this moment to talk to Browning, and believe it or not, was actually invited to sit by the facility with the manifestation of Forerunner benches, or as John dubbed them, smart architecture. Not sure if this was a reactive feature or if it was maybe Joy's doing, but it unironically made me laugh while reading this section. But it's here that the medic opened up about the times he would be taken from his cell by the Harbinger, whom he doesn't necessarily make out to be a torturous individual. In fact, he describes their time together as being a drastic change for the better, being given plenty of proper food and even given a break from the cold and dirty prison cell. Although she would talk to him for hours, with words that bored into his brain like hooks, sometimes causing him to become nauseous and even lose time completely. It is also revealed that during his time with Spartan Nina Kovan in his early days on the ring, he was told to make audio logs of his experiences, which he was certain that the Harbinger knew of, yet never stopped him from doing so. He also mentions that there was another prisoner inside the tower, one who survived longer than all the others, and someone he owes whatever was left of his sanity to, who we then learn was Spartan Hudson Griffin, yet another Spartan casualty, but one that really hit home with Chief. Their conversation quickly shifts as Browning begins to speak in words that Chief thinks are not his own, beginning to say things like, "I know that freeing her people was her goal, it was all she cared about, how the Endless were imprisoned by the Forerunners. They could not defend themselves, they could not reason with them." It was clear to John that the Zalanin still had a hold over his mind, but it was made even more clear when Browning heard Chief mention that the Harbinger was now dead. He then entered a relieved yet almost flustered state, which ended with him slowly lifting his head up to Chief saying, "Did you do it? Did you kill her? Were you the one?" This chilling moment was only made more ominous as, at the same time, Joy was being attacked within the archive. Feeling as though tendrils had burrowed their way into her code, she could feel an overwhelming force ripping Despondent Pyre's encephalon core from her. She screamed while frantically holding on the best she could, but a voice rang out to her in a suffocating wave. "Your cries are but an echo, wind rattling an empty cage. Your meddling is over, young one. I will warn you only once." Now, earlier I had mentioned that Joy had felt a presence watching over her and Chief, and I believe that this entity that had just stolen the encephalon core was that same presence monitoring them, and also the same entity responsible for the portal that appeared to Chief and Joy while the silent auditorium collapsed around them. And if you can recall from the campaign, there is one entity also teased to be on the ring that has been around for a very, very, very long time, who I believe to be Offensive Bias. There's not a whole lot to support my theory at this time, and this is kind of a spoiler for later in the story, but we do know that Offensive Bias has a purpose for being on the ring and cannot be undermined. More on that later. But with this violation and theft now over, Joy was suddenly shoved out of the plinth, terrified, and now without the encephalon. But not all was lost, as she did retrieve a partial schematic for the archive. Just then, Esparza would be alerted to incoming Banished signatures, so he quickly laid some C-10 charges and attempted to lift off from the area. And just as a Phantom was locking in on the Pelican, a rocket flew out of the jungle canopy and knocked the enemy aircraft out of the sky. Very thankful for the assistance, he didn't want to waste the opening. But choosing to blow the charges a bit too early, he not only destroyed the entrance to the archive, but also tore a hole in the Pelican, causing it to come crashing down. Moments later, a squad of Sangheli rushed the Pelican and began inspecting the ship for needed repairs. Having blacked out during the crash, Esparza comes to without getting a good look at them, letting off a warning shot without hesitation. The shot bounces off of the shield of his would-be attacker, and to his surprise, he is quickly reprimanded in English, with the elite who had begun to scold him turning out to be one of the Swords of Sanghelios personnel who were aboard the UNSC Infinity before its attack. And the reason that they were in this area was to hunt. Noticing the explosion overhead, the rest of the team then pushed further into the facility, soon stumbling upon a vast room filled with countless columns which held a wide array of alien creatures from across the galaxy. Many John was unfamiliar with, but among them would be a sample of the largest ape creature he had ever seen, resembling the prehistoric Gigantopithecus. As they continued through the area, Browning began to feel some sort of voice in his head, a compulsion almost guiding him in a certain direction, soon causing him to break into a sprint. And it's here that the team comes across a Lifeworker Huragok that is greenish in color, identifying itself as Rises High. Rises High then communicates to Joy that it is familiar with Gaesh technology and offers to scan Browning. He accepts, and Rises High provides some very cryptic answers on the Gaesh, determining that yes, the Gaesh is of Xalanen origin, but it cannot be removed. However, it can be rewritten, and after further analysis, it reveals that it does store a preliminary access code to a location unknown. And as frustrating as it was, it only made sense, as the Forerunners had gone to great lengths to hide any information regarding the Xalanen. But just as soon as it could not provide an answer, the Hurugok told Joy that it could provide an escort from Lifeworker Central. But as Rises began to dart through the columns, Banished signatures popped up on Chief's radar, not far behind. As they ran to their exit, Joy then spoke privately with Chief, with John asking if Browning's Gaesh was only one part of a larger plan. Joy agreed with his assumption, and then reminded him that just before she died, the Harbinger had sent a message out to someone, somewhere, locally on the ring, saying, "You have what you need. Tell them I am sorry it took so long." Now, from the perspective of us as the gamer, I think the obvious answer here is that she was speaking directly with Atriox, having given him both the location and the very same access key that resided in Browning's Gaesh. And this is why, at the end of Halo Infinite, we get that very mysterious cutscene with Atriox resting a device on a Forerunner plinth that then opens up to a large chamber filled with silexes, which of course must have contained the Xalanen, or as they kept being referred to as, the Endless. Quickly summarizing this next section, as the video is already getting incredibly long, they were under the impression that somehow the Banished were tracking Browning, perhaps through some side effect of the Harbinger's Gaesh, yet unclear. Rises High then brought them to a Forerunner gondola, which sped through the ring's subsystems until they emerged into a desert. And after several failed attempts, they were unable to re-establish communications with Esparza, and then transferred over to a rail system of sorts, with the Banished quickly reappearing hot on their trail. Able to outmaneuver them, Chief was able to get Browning out of fire and into another cave, which led them to a Forerunner translocation pad. Stepping on board and activating it, they emerged into the ruins of the Silent Auditorium. And once they had reached the Harbinger's body, Rises drifted down to her and began probing at her armor, seeming to be looking for something. The Hurugok then shifted its attention to one of the terminals at the base of one of the cubic statues, then activating it and causing a beam to emerge that completely enveloped Chief and Joy, quite literally pulling them inside of the statue, with the last thing that they saw being Browning's face looking on in horror. When the sudden surge of light and energy had subsided, they realized that they were no longer standing in the ruins of the Silent Auditorium, but in fact, a completely intact and pristine version of the room. And as they were trying to make sense of everything that had just happened, they realized that they were not alone. We have now been transported back to the year 97,368 BCE, directly into a memory from the Grand Edict, which featured him and two other individuals, Inspector Meritus and the Chief Judicate, some of the last surviving members of the Criterion, a Forerunner council who had always operated in the shadows of society to guide the Forerunner's destiny. Joining them were Zeta Halo's Monitor, Despondent Pyre, and the Medarch class Ancilla, Offensive Bias. And it is here that they have invited a delegation of Xalanen leadership, including the Harbinger herself, under the guise of a parley. The Xalanen were described as all having features that resembled mollusks or cephalopods, but no two looked alike, all sporting their own unique features and unique armors as well. And alongside them were their servant tools, the Skimmers or Gaskira, a thrall-like species which had similar anatomical features, leading the Forerunners to believe that they were actually an extension of the Xalanen race, having either been created or bred by them. Now, despite their cataloging of the galaxy species, the Xalanen had completely avoided the Forerunners' detection, only being discovered in the years following the firing of the Halo array. And even with constant monitoring since their first contact, almost nothing had been learned about their origins, or how they could have possibly survived the array. But when asked to divulge their secrets, these delegates refused, instead simply claiming to be peaceful explorers, observers, and scholars who merely wished to exist. And despite this dialogue having been referred to as a trial, there was no discussion to be had, as the Criterion had already come to their conclusion. The Xalanen's powerful and inexplicable nature made them too dangerous to be left to their own devices. That and their already advanced civilization was a direct threat to humanity's inheritance of the mantle of responsibility. So in a swift motion, these delegates were contained, the rest of the Xalanen were placed into silexes, and all records of their kind would be wiped from existence. The Grand Edict then charged Despondent Pyre and Offensive Bias with researching their biology to try and find a way to nullify their supposed immunity, operating under the impression that, if successful, they could one day be freed from their imprisonment. But as we know from Halo Infinite, that day never came. As the Grand Edict's memory imprint was coming to an end, Chief and Joy re-emerged into the present-day Silent Auditorium. And much to their horror, they would find Lucas Browning mortally wounded and the lifeworker engineer nowhere to be found. This is because during their unintentional time away, Jega and Banished forces had located them, and much to his delight, his plan had yielded fruit. And I imagine that he also would have preferred to have had the chance to fight the demon one more time, but that can wait for another day. Upon his brief interrogation of the Huragok, he would learn that it wasn't going to be easy getting answers. So much like he had done with Browning, he felt that in time, he could break the creature to his will. But his pet's usefulness had finally come to its end. So he lifted Browning into the air, ignited his arm-mounted blade, and stabbed the human in his gut. Jega then grabbed the body of the Harbinger, and the engineer followed, still compelled to it for some unknown reason. But with them gone, Browning would receive no aid and began to die a slow and agonizing death. And he would lay there for almost an hour before working up the strength to approach the terminal that Rises High had used to transport Chief and Joy away. And although his actions certainly sealed his fate, he did catch a glimpse of their return before slipping into darkness. Chief did his best to seal the wounds with biofoam, but it honestly wouldn't make a difference. And with Rises High nowhere to be found, he was forced to carry him over his shoulder as he sprinted out of the Forerunner structure at his top speed. Banished forces had arrived to cut them off, but Esparza and his new Swords of Sanghelios allies heroically made their entrance. Having commandeered a Banished Phantom, they jumped into the fray, with the Sangheli quickly working to pick off the remaining Banished troops as John made his way towards the Phantom. But as the alerts blared throughout his HUD and he felt Lucas go limp in his arms, he ran past the Phantom and slid down into a grassy knoll, realizing that even after his best efforts, Lucas Browning had just died in his arms. However, he did not die in some banished prison or alone in some Forerunner labyrinth. He died under a blue sky, in the fresh air, as a free man. And a day later, away from the hustle and bustle of the Lifeworker Central encampment, a funeral would be held in his honor. In the days that followed, Chief, Joy, and Esparza would join up with Commander Thompson and the other survivors, all staying busy to help them deal with their grief. Esparza had gone on to regroup with the Swords, allowing them to make good on a promise to fix his Pelican, soon journeying to a different region, having it repaired by a group of UNSC survivors. Among them, Spartan Nina Kovan, Eric Bender, and Robin Demick, 3 people who Lucas had saved during the Battle of the Mortal Reverie. Chief would also do his part by going out every day to monitor their perimeter, working alongside Kovan to deal with banished patrols and clear outposts. But for Joy, she would spend the next 3 days working alongside the camp's technicians to repair a sub-monitor's carapace that Kovan and her crew had salvaged, using its empty matrix as a housing for Jeannie and the other archive scientists, with a different eye color to denote each of the 5 personalities stored within. And no longer confined to this Lifeworker facility, their first excursion would be 3,000 kilometers away in hopes of identifying more UNSC survivors. And while there were still no signs of the UNSC Infinity, their long-range cameras were able to capture visuals of multiple UNSC holdouts, where large groups of survivors, more than anyone else had seen on the ring, had banded together. This invigorated the camp, and even though the threat of the Banished and Endless was still ever present, they were ready for whatever came next. This was not the end of the novel, however, as the perspective shifts back again to Rdomnai Keep, where Jega had begun interrogating Rises High, still fixated on understanding the purpose of Browning's Gaesh and the importance of the Huragok staying with the Harbinger's body. He then began questioning the Huragok about the Encephalon core, which it believed was still in the possession of Joy. However, as we know from her time in the Lifeworker archive, it was stolen from her by a mysterious entity, who I still believe to be offensive bias, with the Ancilla having been concerned that if it had fallen into the wrong hands, it would interfere with his age-old directive of finding a cure for the Xalanans' immunity, or that their interference would lead to their premature escape. The epilogue of the story then changes to a completely different location than from anywhere else in the book, being Vadam Keep on Sanghelios. Here we learn that the Arbiter's forces are still engaged with the Banished on Suban, with the conflict having been prolonged due to shifting alliances among the Sangheli leadership. We also learn that Spartan Olympia Vale has been assisting in their efforts in the past months, and after a recent battle is returning to the keep in a flustered state, mainly because the Arbiter had not joined her. But he had more important matters to attend to. This matter, the Arbiter then revealed to Vale, was that the Swords had received a transmission from deep space, sent in Forerunner glyphs. A quick translation revealed that the transmission had originated from Zeta Halo, including a UNSC distress signal and the post-jump coordinates of the Ringworld, meaning for the first time in 6 months, they knew the whereabouts of the UNSC Infinity and her crew. The final section of the book is called Adjunct Harbinger's Lament, with the text being written in the form of a poem, and as the name suggests, it is from the perspective of the Harbinger. Now, I feel this section is written in a way that could yield multiple interpretations depending on how you interpret specific lines throughout the text, but I believe that it has huge implications for the Halo universe, and due to the deeper meaning that I think is hidden within, I'm going to have to make a separate video altogether where I break down each of these different lines and talk about what I think they truly mean. But for the sake of this video, as a quick generalization, she revealed their origins, having been the creation of Abaddon. They emerged from a dust, taking on many forms, and went out into space, helping propagate new life, preserving, cultivating, building, doing as their creator had done before them. Some of their kind had been kept close, some were sent away, and some even remain among us. They sat and watched as the galaxy grew, completely outside of the knowledge of other races, potentially meaning that they may have watched the Milky Way galaxy from its very beginning. She then goes on to talk about what we understand as the ancient history of the Forerunners, their genocide of their creators, the precursors, and then of course the Flood, the firing of the Halos, and then ultimately how the firing of the Halos led to their separation from an eternal font, which I can only assume refers to their connection to the domain, which we know was greatly damaged sometime after the Halos fired. And then the rest is more in line with the title of the text, as the Harbinger laments how she only wishes that she could show the truth when it comes to the Forerunners' lies about humanity and how they were the true inheritors of the mantle of responsibility. She then talks a bit about death, and makes it seem as though, despite being a member of the Endless, her life is coming to its end. Not sure if this means that she knows that her battle with the Master Chief is coming and she's going to die, or if this poem was just sort of a split-second thing that she had prepared right at the moment that she had failed to stop him. Either way, like I said, there's really a lot to think about when it comes to this section, so sometime in the new year I'd love to touch on this more, because I think my interpretation is going to be a little bit different than some others. Alright, and with that, we have come to the end of this incredibly long summary. And really just to sum up my feelings on the novel, I gotta say it was an all-around great addition to Halo's library, and I think Kelly Gay did a really great job with world building and fleshing out some of the characters who I think definitely deserved more spotlight in Infinite, especially Jega Rdomnai, even though he was really only a smaller portion of the story. But I would probably be lying if I didn't say I was a little disappointed that we didn't get more information on the whereabouts of Atriox, who I think was only mentioned by name maybe 2 or 3 times throughout the entire novel, or even some further clarification on the status of the Endless, as well as their overall goal. But that's not to say we weren't given some clues, and honestly, it's probably for the best that huge plot points to drive the future of Halo don't happen in the books. But with that said, I don't think there's really anything to be upset about in terms of Kelly Gay's storytelling, as she could really only do so much with what Halo Studios allowed her to cover, and they made it very clear that this was merely a bridge between Halo Infinite and whatever game comes after. And again, I really just gotta say I love the depth that we saw with Chief and his little interactions that he had with other characters, especially Commander Wes Thompson. Cool guy, I'm sure, with a name like that. Now, in terms of what comes next, I suppose we'll just have to wait and see, but I am really hoping that Arby makes his way to Zeta Halo, Atriox makes his return, and the Endless show their true intentions. There's a lot of theories and ideas that I had coming to the end of this book, and some I talked about, like offensive bias being the entity that stole the Encephalon core, and some I didn't really get into, like how and why I think the Endless are separate, but also the same thing as the Precursors, but I'm sure you all have theories of your own as well. So please feel free to ask questions and discuss everything down in the comments section below. And hey, if you really liked this super long summary that took me a bunch of hours to write, record, and edit, I would really appreciate it if you dropped a like and subscribed for more Halo content. But that's it for today, so I will see you in the next video.